We'll get started. So my name is Damien Clifford. I think a lot of people know that already. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So today we have Dr. Steph Koorey here to present on banning new lethal autonomous weapons systems, possibilities and pitfalls. So a fascinating topic. As with all the other seminars, it's going to follow the same format. So Steph is going to speak for about, I think, 25 minutes or 30 minutes, we'll see. And then Dr. Cassandra Steer has agreed to be the discussant for today. So Cassandra is a senior lecturer here in college. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Steph to get started.
Thank you, Damien. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I apologise if any of those images in that opening credits were... if you're feeling sensitive about that, I'm happy to talk through the stories behind each of those pictures with anyone if they're interested. But I put them up because they're a video loop of stills of landmines, cluster munitions, landmine survivors, and then the diplomats at the end would sort of like indicate how the process of law changed. I have worked for some of the organisations here which I'm mentioning, and I'm not a lawyer. So this is me coming into this from an arms control point of view. I'd also like to say I do still have a plaster on my nose, so it's not Tom's poor camera work that makes me look pixelated. There is actually a plaster there. So this is the way I'd like to proceed. Look at these sort of 3x3 format. The point, I think, is we'll go through the first two civil society-led campaigns and why I think they're important in the development of international law, and consider whether this third preemptive ban is needed or feasible. And I've got three main concerns about that. The weapons types that I tend to research are conventional weapons. What that means is non-WMD, non-weapons of mass destruction. Can include everything from small arms, which is what a lot of my work has been on, but conventional arms control in general, up to warships and missile launchers. And there are multiple international mechanisms to control or manage conventional arms. The focus today will be on anti-personnel landmines. Exhibit A. This is a mock. It's made of wood. But that's sort of like an indication of what I'm talking about when I say anti-personnel landmine. And I recognise we have two people here who've served in uniform, one in the Australian Army, so might defer to you on some things, Clive, if needed. Cluster munitions. Again, those are images. They're little like round ball type sub-munitions that are meant to explode on impact. And then look at this new category of lethal autonomous weapons systems, which is a broad category and not a particular weapons type, which might be part of the problem. Anti-personnel landmines. They were in widespread use and in stockpiles used by militaries around the world. Their tactical use is as like a barrier. So their military utility was said to be, we put these in various places to maim those who might come across them, to stop people from getting where you don't want them to. Now, I've got a whole background on that, and I'm pleased to say my book chapter with Springer on civil society coalitions and the humanitarian campaigns to ban landmines and cluster munitions was finally published today. So if you want more information, I can direct you to that. But by early 1991, a coalition emerged, partly from the experiences of Vietnam War veterans, that catalysed into an international humanitarian-led campaign to ban these particular weapons. Why? The big argument was that they provided proof of civilian victim activation after the conflict had ended. So then military utility was questioned. It was mostly civilians that were becoming the victims to anti-personnel landmine explosions, especially children, because they're particularly attracted to little shiny things. And you saw how hard they were to see as well. If you see something shiny, you're not educated in it, then a lot of children get quite injured by these, and there are a considerable number of deaths every year still. Victim involvement in the campaign, people who had, as you saw in the reel, people who had been survivors or victims, there's a bit of a dispute over which phrase is correct, were involved. They were flown to diplomatic conferences. We had video and photo images of them coming to Geneva and around the world to talk to diplomats and politicians. Middle powers became, and given the time, 1991, the end of the Cold War, middle powers were starting to flex their muscles and say, well, this is a foreign policy issue that perhaps we could pick up. In the case of landmines, Canada. You might remember images of Princess Diana shortly before her death in the minefields in, I think it was Angola, and then also Bosnia-Herzegovina. There are other royals involved as well, but she gave it additional, raised it on the international stage. They evaded traditional lawmaking, and I'll get to that in a moment, but they did refer to the principles of international humanitarian law of proportionality and distinction. And those two will be a continuing theme. Disproportionately affecting civilians, and they are victim activated. So they don't distinguish between whoever steps on them. It doesn't know whether you're enemy forces or a rabbit or a child. It's detonated by the victim. And there was continued research and accountability into all of these arguments that came out in mighty tomes like this. The Landmine Monitor report, every country pretty much in the world is covered in that, and they continue to make that available online. So countries were made accountable. I remember driving around Canberra delivering these to different embassies and talking with diplomats about it. And it became quite invaluable, not only for knowing what we said about, well, what the Landmine Monitor report said about their own country, but what it says about others. What that ended up in was a legally binding treaty on landmines, anti-personnel landmines. There are other types of mines. They focused on anti-personnel landmines. They did that by evading the Conference on the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. It's a horrible mouthful, known as the CCW. Because they couldn't get it through there. In the conference, in the CCW, there is provision for landmines, but it's about their use, and only use in war. What this coalition wanted was an outright ban. So they left the CCW process, and led by Canada, hence we end up with the 1997 Ottawa Convention. Fastest entry into force of any multilateral arms-related treaty, huge number of states parties to the landmine treaty, and considerable norm building against use, certainly against production, but certainly use. Even non-state armed groups sign up to a parallel process called Geneva Call, whereby they agree not to use anti-personnel landmines. So the normative value of it was enormous, as well as the legality of it. Cluster munitions. We fast forward to the 2006 Hezbollah-Israel war. You probably know Hezbollah is a non-state armed group inside Lebanon, often skirmishes across with Israel, and Hezbollah is supported by Iran. Israel is surrounded by a number of hostile states. There's another example with Israel later as well, and that's because it's one of the few countries actually using these weapons in a hot conflict. Massive use of cluster munitions by Israel on Lebanon, trying to get to Hezbollah, but as a ceasefire was imminent, and that's what the international community couldn't cope with, was the amount of weapons that were, the amount of bomblets, cluster munitions, which Israel said did not had no fail rate. Because they were modern weapons, they'd been tested, they had no fail rate. But it was the fail rate that was the problem, because there was a huge fail rate. I'll show you a video in a moment. Between 25 and 40% failed to detonate on impact, which means they behaved like landmines. Except they were also in the trees. They were caught in the rocks. They're in people's houses, as you'll see in a moment. So again, we have another civil society campaign, the Cluster Munitions Coalition. Again, bringing this time video footage of what happened in Lebanon. There is a man in a hospital bed. If you're sensitive disposition, I'm sorry, I didn't think the images were too bad, but this is what was shown to the diplomats back in Europe.
جنوبي من جنوب لبنان اسمي فضل علي حسن، وها هو ابني موجود وأنتم شفتوه بأم العين. أناشد الضمير العالمي لكي تفجر من قبل الجهات المختصة ويختصر موت أطفالنا ونساؤنا وكهولنا، وشكرا لكم.
Shukran Dakour, thank you very much. Okay. That was shown to diplomats, and this footage by Norwegian People's Aid was as well.
The failure rate between 25 and 40% should indicate that there shouldn't be any more need to test or use these weapons anymore. These weapons have again and again proved that they have no military strategic value. They just leave a huge problem for the civil population, and which we're now seeing the top of the iceberg.
So proof from the field, proof where the conflicts were happening, taken to diplomats to influence their lawmaking and to end up with a legally binding ban on cluster munitions as well. Again, middle power involvement. The Oslo Treaty, as Norway took the lead on this. 110 states parties, significant number of countries in the world. Again, civilian victim activation after the conflict had ended. So children picking time in the fields had cluster munitions caught in the bunches of herbs. As you saw in that video, you could see that there were cluster munitions everywhere. They were actually under the bed in that house. So it makes the impact on societies was coming and making sense to people who were making decisions. Again, victim involvement in the campaign, bringing people who are victims of cluster munition explosions to the diplomatic meetings. And they got pretty high. I don't know if you noticed that was Kofi Annan who one of them met, former Secretary General of the United Nations. Again, evaded traditional lawmaking by Norway taking it on, taking it out of the CCW, and continued research and accountability, this time online rather than in hard copy. So my point is that civil society groups can force states to change their behaviour and uphold new laws and norms. Different people I talk to have different reasons as to why Australia signed up to the Landmine Treaty. The same person gave me two different answers in different times. So there was a lot of reasoning behind it, but the point I'm trying to make here is that civil society groups can create this change and make states think differently about weapons that they're using. So now the new problem, I think it's a problem, lethal autonomous weapon systems. We can't even get clarity on the name as to whether it should be lethal or not. International Committee of the Red Cross doesn't like the term lethal. Others tend to use it. So we even have disagreement on what we're calling them. I'll refer to them as AWS for clarity, even though I've written them as laws, the abbreviation laws. A new campaign to stop killer robots. A lot of people don't like the name. A lot of people don't like the mascot. I didn't put the pictures up there, I don't think they're necessary. But do they have enough momentum, enough experience of knowing how to change international law to prevent new systems coming in that people are calling killer robots or lethal autonomous weapon systems? So, at least 6 countries. And when we think autonomous weapon systems, think about sci-fi dystopias. Think about your Terminator movies. It's not just armed drones. If you want to think what an armed drone might look like, there's a movie put out by Berkeley, a short movie called Slaughterbots. Some people think it's alarmist, some people think it's absolutely on target. Pardon the pun. There are sentries in Israel along the border crossings that are becoming quite autonomous. And let's see if the internet is going to be kind. Okay, there are armed sentries being developed and used along the border between Gaza and Israel. Now I've walked across those borders, and having 19-year-olds with their sniper scopes tracking you as you cross the border is alarming enough. If they're automated systems deciding whether or not to pull a trigger or not, and this is where the problem is. At what point is what is autonomy? So these are the debates which I admit I might have missed some, and I'd really appreciate your thoughts in the discussion. The main arguments are that autonomous weapon systems will save lives, trust the artificial intelligence, keep people off the battlefield. They're faster, can make decisions quicker, and you don't risk human life. Or will we become too trigger happy? They will take lives if you take the human out of the decision loop too early on and they're not making those final decisions. And AI can break. When it goes wrong pretty quickly and pretty spectacularly. A phrase used recently was brittle. Technology is brittle. What is autonomy? We have pilotless drones at the moment, but can we have drones that can kill? Where does the autonomy responsibility come in? And the argument is machines should not be allowed to kill people. The United Nations Secretary General and the Special Rapporteur have articulated concerns. So now it's coming top down. And 30 states have all said that they have huge concerns about the development of autonomous weapon systems. This abrogation of responsibility to a machine, International Committee of the Red Cross said that it violates dignity. In a result that might have been surprising for the authors of this report, 2019 Australian Defence Force Academy Cadet and Midshipmen and Women reported almost 80% of them would not want to deploy along a fully autonomous weapon system. So much for digital natives feeling comfortable with technology. And the loss of human control was their main concern. Who would be responsible for any survivors? There's a risk of hacking. There's always a risk of hacking. Anybody who says they've built an unhackable system is deceiving themselves. As I said, they can malfunction. They can be used by non-state actors who may or may not abide by international law, but I still find all of that quite alarming. Who is liable? Case of military commander. At what point, if they lose control of that decision-making, do they become responsible or not? And this huge risk of moral injury. Australia says it's too early to regulate. Australia's generally been forward-thinking on other arms control issues. But is this about taking into account what the United States is doing, the changing strategic environment, and by that do we mean we don't want to regulate these because we have adversaries emerging in the region? Other arguments are that they're covered by the Martens Clause anyway. In International Humanitarian Law, in the Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, states even when they're not covered by other laws and treaties, civilians and combatants remain under the protection of and authority of the principles of international law derived from custom, from the principles of humanity, and from the dictates of human conscience. So, do we have enough agreement and existing law, or do we actually really need to get in before it's too late? We're already there. If these fully autonomous weapon systems are already in development, we're already there. So, can we really regulate this? I think part of the problem is we have to now use our imagination rather than the narratives of people who are being impacted. I think that was quite powerful of those earlier campaigns. We have to imagine what all these weapon systems might look like and then think about how we feel about it. International humanitarian law fundamentals still apply, particularly distinction and proportionality. But this idea of a pre-emptive ban is that needed or possible without even agreeing on a definition of what we're talking about? There are precedents for preemptive bans, exploding bullets and blinding lasers. But these are very specific weapons types. Can we do it with the power of our imagination? Or have the technical and strategic circumstances just changed too much now for this to even be a possibility in terms of how international law might develop, or whether it's good enough? I was reading, excuse me, so I think everybody should read and write science fiction, but the laws of robotics, maybe we're looking at the wrong laws. In this new book by Frank Pasquale, he talks about the new laws of robotics, and it's basically that we should, well, one of the arguments is that we should stop looking at artificial intelligence and instead look at augmented intelligence, or intelligence augmented. So rather than replacing everything with a machine and technology, we augment existing systems. So we're not losing that control. I'm happy to have your thoughts in the discussion, and Cassandra's been taking notes and things, so hopefully the discussion will be worthwhile. Thank you for coming. I really would appreciate how I can take this research and my thinking forward, and I just really want to acknowledge that the images and videos came courtesy of John Rodstead and Heather Faulkner, the ICBL, CMC and the ANU. If you want to use any of them, please contact them, but that's all I had to say up front for now. Thank you.